We are now live with Igor. Oh my goodness. All right. Welcome everybody to our brand new mini series, Fridays with Igor Sushko, back with us, and he is a wonderful guest. We're so excited that he'll be returning with us the next few Fridays for this mini series. He is a bulldog trainer for 22 years with clients and owners from all around the world coming to seek out his expertise, and excited that he will be joining us to share his insights and all of the knowledge. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Igor. Very quickly, before we hop into the segment, I just want to welcome everybody to please just drop any questions or comments in the chat. We promise we'll get to them this time. We didn't have time to do it last time, but we're really excited to be getting to those later this afternoon. So thank you for joining.
Good evening, Igor. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
It was
Good.
I had a lot of fun a week ago. It feels like it was much longer than a week ago already.
Well,
And
we got a huge response, and we asked you if you'd be willing to do several in a row, and you very graciously accepted, and we appreciate that very much because a lot of people said they learned quite a bit from your first podcast. So while we wait for some questions, why don't you go ahead and begin your presentation?
sure. So really recommend anybody that's tuning in to watch this. It's going to be a continuation of last week's podcast. So definitely, if you haven't seen the first video, it's about, we had an hour and 40 minutes to watch through that first, because in some ways I'm going to be picking up where we left off last time.
Good.
And really, uh, these subjects like veterinary malpractice cannot be separated from some of the core foundational principles of just on organism's health, which a lot it goes back to the immune system function of the dog. And one of the really, really common trajectories that result from veterinary malpractice in that dog owners unfortunately experience with their pets is a continued degradation of the immune system, usually starting with puppyhood by veterinarians, and then all kinds of not just unnecessary, but medications that then further degrade the immune system and make the immune system very dysfunctional. And those uh, medications then just serve to pile on to an already compromised immune system, where the dog is, of course, going to have all kinds of health problems. And they tend to not get addressed because usually the veterinarian that the owner is going to be seeing about those issues is the veterinarian that caused them to begin with. And
Right.
clearly, that kind of veterinarian is not qualified to be practicing medicine, really, as stark as that sounds. Uh, I was, since last week, I actually watched some videos on YouTube where veterinarians are doing uh, short videos like about their life as a veterinarian, and it was so insightful to see how things work within that sphere, and just utter lack of self-awareness of their worldview that they have about veterinary medicine themselves, because they're talking about these things that, without understanding the significance of what they're saying, that really illustrate the fundamental issues of the profession. One was a veterinarian speaking to I guess, a friend of his who's a human doctor, and they had the human doctor take some multiple choice questions. I guess in order to pass the veterinary board exam, it's a multiple choice test with apparently a few hundred or several hundred questions, literally multiple choice. Okay. And they were, the human doctor was missing some very, very just elementary questions, which was just stunning to me. But they were joking about how when he was about 50% passing based on the questions he was answering, that he would be barely passing the exam. So in order to become a vet, you're taking a multiple choice test where if you get something a little over half correct, you become a veterinarian.
You pass.
And it seems to me that it's going to be a systemic issue to where once you have these colleges charging hundreds of thousands of dollars for your education, whether it's in veterinary care or just human medicine, engineering, architecture, whatever it may be, it raises the bar of ensuring that people don't fail so high, right? No matter what their competencies might actually be. If they had just spent 200 grand on their degree and they don't know anything, the system appears to be set up to where you still want them to get licensed and go proceed with their profession. That was sort of my inkling. And one of the things that veterinarian mentioned, he talked about how little veterinarians get paid, while also talking about how expensive veterinary care is, and the cost of veterinary care in the United States is skyrocketing. And this is the point of just utter lack of self-awareness. Where's that money going then? Does that person not bother to ask himself that question? Because there's definitely some truth. He was talking about when he was doing initially going through an internship or residency, because he became a specialist, he was paid very little, like literally $20,000-$30,000 a year while working 60 hours, 70 hours a week, which is insane. Well, the money you're paying at the vet's office, a lot of it is not going to the actual vet that saw your dog. It's going to the facility owner. And that's where the money is going. So there are you will see a trend over the past especially decade, maybe a couple of decades, of these very large corporations going on huge acquisition sprees of veterinary facilities. VCA, for example, one such entity, they're owned by Mars Candy. So they have a very sophisticated system now of vertical integration to where they essentially own every facet that has to do with dog ownership, from dog food to veterinary hospitals to laboratories that the veterinarians have to use and everything in between. And it is when you are reducing that kind of competition, because there are areas, there could be certain neighborhoods in a big city or entire cities where essentially one company owns all or most of the veterinary hospitals. So at that point, there is no longer any competition. They can charge whatever they want. And again, there is some truth to the fact that a lot of vets, they're not getting paid very much, especially when they're early on in their career, which is, it's an issue with the system that the veterinarians are participating in, but they're not talking about that being the issue. They're talking about how a dog owner is supposed to figure out how to pay $4,000 for an MRI, you know? So recommend if you go online on YouTube, check out some of those videos and see if you can notice some of those things. Another really interesting video that this veterinarian showed was he's a neurosurgeon specialist. And he was talked about his most interesting case of 2021. And it's not a long video, it's 10-15 minutes. And again, that apparent total lack of self-awareness of what he's actually saying and how that case transpired and proceeded was just very, very stunning to me. So he began by talking about this dog that had clearly problems with mobility, where the dog appeared to have certain neurological problems. And it was multifaceted. So there were multiple neurological tests that the dog basically failed to where, so it was not just one potential area that's affected, but multiple in terms of the body. And again, it's a 12-year-old dog, and he convinced the owners to do an MRI. And he shows what a healthy dog's brain looks like. And then he shows this dog's MRI, and you can see clear inflammation nearby the brain stem in two separate areas. That's very like mirror image. And that did not give him any conclusive information with regards to any kind of potential treatment, just that there's clearly a neurological problem near the brain stem. There's inflammation, and he goes through the list of what the potential inflammation may be caused by even before taking the MRI. And so there's only a limited number of things that can cause an inflammation in the brain to where the dog is going to be neurologically affected in terms of mobility. And that's going to be some kind of an infection, right? Meningitis, and some kind of autoimmune disorder, that is the immune system itself is causing the inflammation rather than infection, or cancer. Those three things. So he goes through the MRI, which I'm sure the owner had to spend, probably about $4,000, if not more. Then he does a spinal tap to collect the fluid, and he shows on the screen the blood test, and there's elevated red blood cells, but again, nothing conclusive. And so at that point, he says, having done these diagnostics, we're just going to manage what we can, because if it's cancer, we can't really do anything anyway. On a 12-year-old dog, it's absolutely correct. I completely agree with that. And so he just put the dog on a steroid to suppress the immune system, to reduce that inflammation in the brain, and another drug that he said is typically used for cancer patients that also suppresses the immune system. And then the dog began to be able to walk. And so it's his miracle case, his best case of 2021, and he's doing this video with the owner's permission. And what he did as far as treatment goes, the fact that he did that $4,000 MRI or a spinal tap bore absolutely no relevance. It was not even necessary, because he basically came to the conclusion, well, we're going to try this because we don't know what it is after having done the MRI and the spinal tap. And so hopefully the inflammation will get reduced. And again, it's a matter of he's just treating the symptoms, right? Not curing the disease. He's just treating the symptoms. And the owners right now, this is a recent case, are unfortunately, they have this now false hope that the problem is resolved. Whereas, again, it's only the symptoms that have been cured, not cured, but treated. So I don't understand this approach to medicine, where they convinced owners, especially in a 12-year-old dog, to go through all these expenses, and then they're doing the same thing that they could have easily done without going through any of those diagnostics anyway, because those diagnostics yielded them zero information, which he himself basically admitted to on the video. And then you look at the comments, and everybody's clapping their hands saying what a wonderful doctor he is. So yeah, that was just something recent that stuck in my mind. That was just something that I wanted to share with you. Um, with something that is also a recent development, we had a puppy, about a 3-month-old puppy that went to the vet just several days ago, and the owner was given deworming medication, and the tablet, the doses for a dog that's 50 to 100 pounds. So basically, there is that margin where the deworming medication is still considered safe for a 50-pound dog, but the dose is for a 100-pound dog because of that window of safety. So you can double the dose and it's still considered safe, which is why you have a single tablet that is good for a 50-pound dog or a 100-pound dog. Well, this dog they weighed at the vet was 36 pounds. And this prescriptions of incorrect doses of any kind of drugs with veterinarians is extremely common, starting with things like deworming medication, which probably, if you give a dog deworming medication that's intended for a 100-pound dog, that's 36 pounds, I mean, you're tripling the dose. Probably you might be able to get away with it, but there are instances definitely where there were severe reactions that dog had to that kind of overdosing as well. So again, it's just total lack of attention to detail and just reviewing the actual records. Another thing to really be careful of is oftentimes you have in your vet visit, right, you would be seeing the veterinarian, and then whatever the issue might be, the veterinarian might prescribe certain medication. They tell you this is what we're going to do, this is going to be the course. And then it's the assistant or the tech that then comes into the room with the actual bag of whatever pills or medications it might be. And they give you instructions on the dosing with extreme confidence, but it's wrong. Right? It's different than what the vet had just told you 5 minutes prior. So you have to be very vigilant with just checking that information at all stages. You want to confirm really the dosing information with the veterinarian. You want to write things down. You could even ask actually. Most vets, especially like if it's a normal vet, they're not gonna care. Ask them if they can record the visit audio just on your phone. Because oftentimes, right, a lot of information might be covered. Vets love to use, sophisticated medical lingo, jargon, and they sort of think that maybe you understand, but oftentimes, it's not something, those terms are not familiar to a typical owner, and they just breeze through it. So if you record that interaction from the beginning to the end, it could serve you very well in terms of actually having comprehension of what happened and what the vet told you. So we can start off with, I think, a few more examples, concrete examples of veterinary malpractice that we have experienced. The first case is actually going to be a little bit of an exception. It's not a case that we experienced, but here locally, we have a wonderful police officer that's in charge of animal control. Her name is Anne. And this is a situation that she shared with me maybe about a year or so ago that happened here locally, unfortunately. So there was an incident where a dog that was middle-aged, adult dog that was always normal, out of nowhere, attacked, turned on the owner, attacked and mauled the owner. So it was a female owner. She had to have things even like reconstructive breast surgery. And it just completely came out of nowhere. Of course, the dog was put down, but this is again probably not a typical animal control officer, because what she went through was actually the medical records of the dog. She was very thorough in trying to understand what happened, and she had her suspicions. Sure enough, it was a local veterinarian here that saw this dog 6 months prior to this attack. And the reason for that visit was that the owner came in because the dog had some kind of redness, inflammation on the body, maybe the paws or somewhere. And the veterinarian prescribed that dog steroids to be given daily, something like prednisone or prednisolone. So the dog was on steroids for 6 months every single day. And that's when the dog turned. And according to the animal control officer, that is not the first time she's seen that kind of behavioral change in a dog. Of course, if you keep pumping a dog with steroids, they're going to go psycho. And the depressing part about this story is that there isn't really any recourse in her experience against the vet that did it. So she said she gave him a mouthful and said that he's responsible for this, but there wasn't much more beyond that she could do. She said that the veterinary boards uh, that represent each state, they don't really address these things. They don't punish or discipline the veterinarians that do these kind of things.
Right.
She mentioned how it's very difficult to bring a lawsuit against a veterinarian for any kind of malpractice. Oftentimes, and this is where Scott, your organization has been so instrumental to trying to change that paradigm. But she said that she's seen so many legal cases where essentially the most the plaintiff, the victim of that malpractice could get as the owner of the dog was maybe up to the value of the dog when the dog was purchased, but usually it's like $1,000 or $2,000. So your legal expenses are literally many times more than whatever compensation you might get as a result of that lawsuit. And that's been her experience in this. And I think that landscape, obviously, it needs to change, and I know it is changing.
It is changing.
But it's something that everywhere you look, you see these issues. So we can go through a few instances of where our intervention potentially saved our dog owner's dog pet's life. So one instance took place probably about a year ago, and it was a puppy. And puppies do silly things, and they need to be supervised 100% of the time for that reason. And we always ask that our owners, if they don't have 100% adult supervision on the dog, meaning like you're not in the kitchen cooking at the same time, you're not talking to the phone with your friends at the same time or watching TV, you must have full attention on the puppy for the puppy to be outside their crate. And that is until they're done teething, which, like we discussed before, usually about 15 to 18 months of age. And that's for the puppy's own safety, right? They could chew on an outlet, electrocute themselves, they could eat a sock, they could acquire a bunch of bad habits, chewing on shoes, what have you. But it's really dangerous. They could eat stuff that could result in death. So I get a call from the owner with about a 3.5 month old puppy, that the puppy has been having shooting diarrhea and vomiting, no appetite. And I collect as much information as I can, and sometimes it's a difficult aspect of getting the owners to really recall all the details, because I continue to inquire about, was the puppy ever left without supervision outside? And took me several tries of asking that question different ways, and then finally there was an admission that maybe like for a minute. But the thing is, that's plenty. And I explained, and I told the owner, this is an emergency. Until we know more information, we need to treat this as an emergency. And I explained to him specifically the two most likely causes. Given that the puppy was unsupervised for a short period of time, the likeliest scenario here is that the puppy ate something that's not food, right? Some kind of foreign matter. And another alternate possibility, although much less likely, is some kind of an acute onset infection. Could be parvo, could be sometimes bacterial, but viral might fit more. And I explained to them that the vet that he's going to be seeing, because we don't know the vet and he doesn't really know the vet, he has a new puppy, is going to take one of two approaches. One approach would be the correct one, and the other is really common and it's bad. So that's what a bad vet would do. And I told him a bad vet would not do any diagnostics and then prescribe something like an antibiotic or a steroid or both and send the puppy home.
Exactly.
A good vet would immediately do ultrasounds and or x-rays to exclude the possibility of foreign matter inside the stomach or the intestines, and also do any kind of rapid test for whatever the common frequent disease might be in your area, like parvo, especially if it's a seasonal thing. And I was explaining this to the owner while he was already driving to the vet, because I told him he needs to go now, and was basically present throughout that interaction. And sure enough, the first vet that he went to told him that it would be a waste of his money to be doing any kind of ultrasound or x-ray because the puppy clearly didn't need anything, and then gave the puppy amoxicillin or antibiotic that's similar to that. And then of course I was there, so I actually told him, like, don't take that medication. Found him another vet, and in the end they immediately did a rapid parvo test. He was negative. They did an ultrasound. They found a bunch of gravel, and so they treated that. But if you go by what the first vet had said and take that puppy back home with gravel and put him on antibiotics, the puppy could have even possibly died. And in that kind of ingestion, sometimes it can be very, very acute and very fast that the puppy actually dies. So we had a situation. One thing that we always stress to our owners is, because we go through this process of trying to locate a normal vet in their area when a person acquires a dog from us, and I could call the vets and I will talk to them, trying to vet them so that our owner can have somebody that they can go to. And of course, it's still not 100%. But one thing that we always stress is that we need to ensure that, so if I give the owner a name of a veterinarian that works at a certain facility, do not see any other veterinarian at that facility. So quality of veterinary care does not translate from one vet to another just because they happen to work at the same place.
Amen.
And we have, unfortunately, a couple of examples that we experienced ourselves that was pretty stunning. So before we actually found the current vet that we use as a general practitioner, who is just fantastic, she's a breeder herself. And that is actually one of the best indicators for a good vet. This is what we always suggest. If you have a veterinarian in your area that is a breeder, the chances of that vet being good or possibly even exceptional just skyrocket, because they have that understanding of the immune system function, of the needs of a developing puppy and how fragile that organism is. So it's a completely different approach to medicine because the veterinarian has done the whelping, has raised puppies from birth. It's a it's experience that you cannot learn in books or buy or anything like that. So we had been going to this veterinarian um, here in Las Vegas, and he was the only person that we had experience with at that facility, and he was fantastic. But unfortunately, when we had to go and visit uh, these, we need to go to the vet. We had a 9-month-old puppy that had actually um, began to limp a little bit. So she was 9 months old, and we know she was really, jumping around, going crazy. And so it felt like it's probably a sprain, but still we wanted to be careful. And so we wanted to go to the vet. And it was actually the day that our veterinarian was off. And so instead we had the facility, the practice owner, who is a veterinarian, see us. And it's a person that we've never encountered before. And he's looking at this dog where the puppy, she literally is not placing her rear leg on the ground. So she's walking on 3 legs. And he says, that's hip dysplasia. Just from looking at the dog that's not able to place the fourth foot down. And again, that is not a symptom of hip dysplasia. And
Right.
you cannot eyeball hip dysplasia either. You have to do
Right.
actual diagnostics. So uh, he does X-ray on the hips of the dog, and so he does an X-ray on the hips of the dog and brings the X-ray back, and it's just so poorly done. Everything is just completely crooked. And then he still says it's hip dysplasia. And so like we've done so many x-rays, like with pen hip x-rays for evaluating hip health, because we just do that as a on a regular basis for any kind of breeding candidates. I've seen so many of these
Hmm.
x-rays. It was just total crap. And so he basically again just doesn't do anything beyond that and gives us just a few tablets of carprofen. Carprofen is a brand name, is also Rimadyl, right? It's an anti-inflammatory. It's a non-steroidal
Okay.
anti-inflammatory, which is fantastic. Um, but it's also a drug that you have to be very careful with because it does hit the kidneys pretty hard. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be giving your dog an NSAID like that, a carprofen or something similar, um, you have to do it after the full meal. So after the dog is eating, and make sure that dog is always drinking plenty of water. And those things will help ensure that you're minimizing the risk of any kind of organ damage to the kidneys or the liver, because it's
Okay.
metabolized. It's a pretty heavy drug to metabolize for a dog. So of course he doesn't go through any of those warnings, but I mean we know that stuff ourselves, which is good. But usually whenever, in our experience from what we've heard, right, whenever somebody is issued this medication, carprofen, the vets don't really tell you much at all about what things to watch out for. And so really keep in mind, you always want to give carprofen as an anti-inflammatory to your dog after full meal and with lots of water. So the dose that he gave the dog, given that she's a 9-month-old American Bulldog puppy, was good for a day and a half. Because he gave
Mm.
he gave a prescription as if it's like a 20-pound dog.
Right. Right.
um, and um, and it was one of those visits, right? That I'm sure owners can uh, empathize with in terms of having that experience themselves, you leave the office, you don't know what the hell just happened. And so what we actually did then was I contacted the orthopedic specialist. They asked, "Do you have a referral?" Because the previous vet that we just saw was a general practitioner, and I'm like, "No, he never issued one." And so he actually, the specialist, they had to retroactively get the referral from the vet, which in reality, right, it should be, of course, the other way around. That veterinarian, the general practitioner, because if he doesn't know exactly what's going on, all he gave you was like a day and a half worth of an anti-inflammatory. If he doesn't know how to deal with this, he needs to refer you to somebody that does,
Right.
Mhm.
which would be an orthopedic specialist because it's an anatomical issue. And so end up going to the orthopedic specialist, and he does an evaluation of the pup and suggests that, yeah, it's probably just a sprain. And he prescribes the correct amount and dosage of the anti-inflammatory. And the puppy just fully recovered just with that, right? But it started with the veterinarian, who is the practice owner, telling us that this dog has hip dysplasia. So after the puppy had recovered, we go through our regular process of because she was a breeding candidate. We did pan hip X-rays for hips. Fantastic hips, you know. Um, so always take any kind of eyeball diagnosis with a grain of salt. Usually it's completely incorrect.
Yeah.
Um, same practice, different vet. This one is a little more, you know, dangers in terms of potential repercussions of the type of malpractice. We had a dog that had a little bit of vaginal discharge, and it wasn't very severe. It wasn't significant. She didn't even have a fever. But we took her into the vet, and again, our vet, his day off. So we have to see this different vet, and he tells us that the dog has pyometra and that we must immediately, like that day, right now, remove her uterus. We have to spay her right now or she will die. And of course, we don't buy that. And we ask him, so if it is pyometra, then what kind of you know treatment could we first try before going that alternate route of removing the dog's uterus? And he named a couple of drugs, which is typical antibiotics. And I said, okay, well, can we start with that? And he told us he's not comfortable giving us that prescription. So we leave the office. We source the antibiotics anyway. We go through that regimen. All that vaginal discharge completely disappears very quickly. And then actually, we ended up seeing to test again because that first vet had done an ultrasound, so he saw some fluid buildup in the uterus. Um, we saw our regular vet at that same facility a couple months later to do a follow up to see if this uncurable pyometra had resolved. And so I have him first do an ultrasound, and he says, yeah, she's completely clean. There's no infection or anything. And then I tell him that actually we were here a couple months ago, and his colleague so and so told us that this dog had deadly pyometra, and he wanted to remove her uterus that day, or she was gonna die. And the vet, of course, went very sort of, quiet, and like he didn't want to badmouth the other vet, and he's like, no, like there's nothing here, you know. Um, and this is how you get suckered into these surgeries. They're just completely ridiculous. Again, it goes back to that spaying and neutering that we covered during the last week's podcast. the consequences to the dog's health from spaying and neutering when you're removing, especially the ovaries, right? Those sex hormone generating organs, whether it's male or female, they can be devastating over the life of the dog. And so some of the things that I failed to cover last week, just we really ran out of time because I just kept talking. Um, One of the very common refrains that you have to be look out for if you have a puppy and you're taking the puppy to the vet, and they tell you that uh, you need to neuter your puppy because it's going to prevent prostate cancer. A lot of owners hear that all the time from vets, and it's actually 100% false. So there's actually a study that we also cite on our website, specifically with regards to prostate cancer. The incidence of prostate cancer in dogs, to begin with, very low, but there is no difference in incidence. It's as common as it is in dogs that are neutered as it is dogs that are intact. Reason being, even if you remove the testicles, you still have the prostate. And in fact, all kinds of cancers, the risk of that skyrockets as a result of spaying and neutering surgeries. Going back to what we discussed last week, the immune system function is going to suffer because it doesn't have the modulating effects that the sex hormones provide to the organism's function. Um, but also, bone cancer is one of the most common types of cancers in dogs. And the risk of bone cancer also skyrockets mysteriously, although it's not a mystery at all, in dogs that are spayed or neutered. And that is because it goes back to that uncontrolled bone growth that we discussed last week, where because the bones don't close when they're supposed to, and they continue to grow, uh, as a result of the organism's inability to send that sex hormone signal to close the place on the bones when the dog hits maturity. Because that doesn't happen, the bones continue to grow and become larger than they're supposed to be naturally. Well, that is a definition of uncontrolled bone growth, those cells multiplying. And so that can actually manifest itself as bone cancer any time in the dog's life. Could be years down the line, could be 6, 7, 8 years old. But the risk factor that definitely affected that happening, one of them is going to be the spay and neuter surgery. So another instance where we had to really interfere with our with the medical care that was provided one of our owner's dogs, and this was a very much another emergency that was life-threatening without question. It was a puppy 6, 7 months old, and uh, the symptoms as the owner described to me, and this happened unfortunately like in the middle of the night when the owner called me, very, very suspicious of poisoning. So maybe the dog got into rat poison somewhere, some kind of poisoning uh, in terms of the dog's symptomatics. And so the owner took the dog to the vet. The dog was basically like not moving, you know, breathing less. I mean, all the symptoms of the dog dying. And uh, they had to bang on the emergency vet's door after initially, like, they were seen by some receptionist, told to wait outside in the parking lot for like 2 hours. Because the way they triaged, for some reason, this dog was not considered to be critical. And then finally, they during this waiting period, I told the owner what I thought, right, and what the vet what I wanted them to tell the vet immediately was we need to get the blood tests done for to exclude poisoning. So there's specific blood tests like for coagulation, right? How the blood actually uh, what do you call that? Well, coagulates, right? So it stops the flow, right? The bleeding
Mm-hmm.
stops because um, uh, and and so there are specific blood tests for that, and that would be a clear indicating of potential poisoning. And I asked them the owner to tell the vet, so you want to do the blood test to exclude whatever blood tests beside coagulation that the vet wants to do to exclude poisoning. And once those blood tests are done, immediately put the dog on an IV, something like Ringers or plasma light, or maybe just like regular saline. But hydrate that dog so that you can dilute whatever toxin is in the system and help the dog that way, while any kind of remaining diagnostics have to be done. But it's important to do the blood test prior to it so you have a good sample. So finally, when they do see the vet a couple hours later, uh, the vet tells me that they have no blood test they can do for poisoning, which is like just stuns me. And then uh, they do an ultrasound. No, they do an X-ray. They do an X-ray on that dog, and she sees a very big, like dark blot in the stomach. And she tells the owners specifically that that is some kind of a piece of a rag that the dog ate. And that is why the dog is exhibiting these symptoms. So from an X-ray seeing some kind of dark blot, she tells the owner categorically that it's a rag. And the owners were telling the vet and telling me, like, there's no chance the dog didn't need any rag. And I again, I wasn't, because this was happening in the middle of the night there, and there was very little communication between the vet and the owners as well. I didn't know what the status was on the fluids. And I asked, like, so is the dog on an IV? And they told me no. I talked to the vet directly, and I tell her, like, we need to put him on an IV immediately. And she says, what a great idea. And so they put him on the IV. Like, without my intervention, she wasn't going to do that. So the dog becomes quite a bit more stable after that IV, probably got about a liter, and was feeling a little better. And clearly, this vet wasn't able to do any kind of diagnostics. So we had the owner take the dog home, and then we sent him to a regular vet that was reliable in the morning. And sure enough, they do the X-ray and an ultrasound, and that blot is gone in the stomach. And the vet tells me that was a blood clot, right? So the dog was bleeding internally, again consistent with potential poisoning. And the reason that the dog recovered quickly without anything else is because they did at least the liter IV that I asked him to do. So if it was a mild poisoning, right, to where the dog had enough strength to sort of cleanse itself, right? That IV bag was what did it, is what helped it get rid of those toxins, whatever the dog's ingested. And here we don't even have a final diagnosis because the dog was back to normal by the time it was seen the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So, and these are emergency vets, right? Like doing a subcutaneous, or not a, well, yeah, in dogs, a subcutaneous, like subcutaneous fluids, that's the first go-to thing when a dog is exhibiting symptoms of poisoning, even if the vet is just so clueless, doesn't even know there's a test for blood coagulation that they can do. Because clearly, the reason that the dog had that blood clot developed that was pretty significant in the stomach was because the blood wasn't clotting properly. So there was internal bleeding. Um, let's see. So this was a pretty scary case of going back to something we covered extensively last week, vaccination. Um, so what uh, we ask our owners to do, as you may recall, is you do the rabies and do the third booster for things like parvo, parainfluenza, coronavirus, distemper on at 3 months old, and so no more vaccinations after 3 months old for the year. And the owner in Utah took his pup, 3 month old, got the rabies vaccine, and then also got the booster. And then shortly thereafter, unfortunately, this is something that happens more frequently than I would like. We hear about a situation, a problem with the dog days later instead of immediately, even though we stress to our owners, just call me immediately if something is wrong with the dog. And so here I heard back from him uh, a week after that vaccination. And at that time, the dog was in dire straits. So he was unable to move his rear legs, had lost several pounds. So a 3 month old American Bulldog puppy would be gaining probably 3 pounds a week, if not more. Instead of gaining 3 pounds from vaccination a week ago, he had lost like 3 or 4 pounds. He wasn't eating, he wasn't drinking. And the owner called me only after he had already also taken that puppy to the same vet that did those vaccinations. And I'm getting this information from the owner as to what the vet told him. And the vet had told the owner that this is some kind of growing pains and use some kind of weird medical jargon, some kind of specific type of hypoplasia or dysplasia, something like that, with regards to not like hip dysplasia, but it's like the actual bone not growing correctly or something like that. Because the puppy is big, according to the vet, and is growing very fast. And to us, this puppy, completely average size, completely average rate of growth, nothing extraordinary or special about him. We've seen hundreds of dogs like this in terms of size and rate of growth. So that was just, again, like not something that we've ever experienced in terms of the diagnosis that the vet had made. And again, the vet had made that diagnosis just eyeballing the dog. And it doesn't explain any other symptoms of the dog not wanting to eat, not wanting to drink, losing weight, and all of that. My suspicion, Olga and I, right, my wife, well, we always consult together and try to figure out what might be going on. Immediately, something might be there with the vaccines. And so we started looking up different symptoms of the diseases that might be causing it for which the puppy was just vaccinated. And distemper, it's a deadly disease. And one of the symptoms is the dog essentially gets paralysis on their hind legs. Inability, like lack of desire to eat, weight loss, like everything, all the symptomatics are consistent with distemper. And the issue with, the risk that the owners need to be aware of with regards to specifically the distemper vaccine. So rabies vaccine, as an example, it's a killed virus to where you can never get rabies from a rabies vaccine. However, there are some vaccines for other diseases where they use live pathogens to elicit that immune response. Distemper is one of them. So a distemper vaccine for dogs is a live distemper virus that has been altered to minimize the risk of actually turning into infection. And it went back to, we suspect this is distemper. And the reason that that would happen is improperly stored or expired vaccine, right? The owner never got even the expiration date or any kind of information like that from the vet. It was also very puzzling. And we directed him to go to a specialist because he was going to that vet a couple of times by this point, and it was just like utter nonsense in terms of what the vet was saying. And as soon as he went to a specialist, unfortunately had to go like 2 hours away, they extracted joint fluid from the rear legs, and instead of it coming back clear and fluid, it was gooey and yellow. So there was a severe inflammation and infection in the joints. And the reason that we believe that the dog actually didn't, have it worse as a result of that distemper infection that we suspect it was, is because he already had 2 prior vaccinations for distemper that were valid. So the dog at least had some immune protection from distemper to where it didn't turn out to be deadly. And the joint fluid that was extracted was actually appears to have been a secondary bacterial infection, to where once the dog again was given IV fluids, because he was clearly dehydrated even based on the description the owner was providing me from the very beginning, that vet never gave the dog any kind of fluids. This is the first go-to thing you do if the dog is dehydrated and is sick. It helps really, really fast. And it seems to be completely underutilized. That bag of saline is like $5 for a liter. It costs nothing, and there aren't really any kind of side effects to the health. You're just hydrating the dog. Hydration allows the organs to function better, more efficiently. It helps cleanse the body of any kind of toxicity. It's just great all around with just no risk. And that first vet didn't do it. Of course, the emergency vets, they immediately hydrated the dog. He was improving very drastically, very quickly as a result of their diagnosis and the subsequent antibiotics that they gave based on actual culture results of that joint fluid. So they actually did the correct procedure, which is what you do. If you suspect an infection, you have to culture it to identify what the actual infection is. If it's a bacteria, you send it off to a lab, it will name the actual bacterial strain. But more importantly, what the lab does is they will split up that specimen into multiple samples, and then they would grow that culture and apply a huge range of different antibiotics once they identify it as a bacteria that should work, and they will come back with a sheet that lists 2 dozen different antibiotics that they tested for, and will say that given bacteria is either susceptible, intermediate, or resistant. So intermediate means moderately susceptible but not completely susceptible. So it's not an antibiotic you want to use. Resistant is not an antibiotic you want to use. You only want to use an antibiotic that the bacteria that's specifically present is susceptible to, right? And so they went through that process correctly, like all vets are supposed to do when there's suspicion of an infection, gave the dog that antibiotic, and the dog recovered very fast. But again, it was that fluid that helped the dog help jumpstart that recovery from that severe infection that somehow found its way into the joints, right? So, there's always this pattern of just vets not diagnosing things, just guessing at things, and not even doing the simplest things, to where you have to literally tell an ER vet at 2 a.m., the dog that's dying from suspected poisoning, give the dog some saline. And they tell you that it's a great idea and goes on to do it, and goes back to, if you have like over 50% on an exam that's multiple choice, you become a vet. I mean, that's ridiculous. I think this could be a good time to see if you guys have any questions, any specific areas that you would like me to address.
Yeah, one quick question from the comments is, what are the bulldogs like? Do American bulldogs have more medical issues as they get older? Is that something to be on the lookout for with that breed in particular?
No. So it's not the breed really that and it's the same with regards to like any breed, like, you know, whether it's English bulldogs or, I mean, what have you, right? Like generally speaking, like a brachycephalic type breed. So all these bulldogs, um, or the, like mastiffs, even, right? So like
Mhm.
these dogs that have a brachycephalic skull structure, they have certainly like different anatomies to it. They can be there are hereditary factors, genetics at play that are these genetic diseases that are more common in brachycephalic breeds, but that is not something that you can generalize to all dogs within that breed. It's a
Okay.
matter of how good the genetics are of the given dog. So, for
Mm.
example, something that we've so for example, as a to give you a little bit of background, so the dogs that my wife Olga produces, American Bulldogs, males, they're anywhere from 100 to 135 pounds in weight, right? So it's a pretty large breed. Male is almost the same size. Average lifespan that we see in our dogs, that we produce now over 22 years, is about 11, 12 years old. The very first dog that my wife actually started with, fortunately, lived to 15 years and 10 months old. And so we have plenty of dogs that are on the beyond the 12 years of age. They're 13, 14, 15 years old, alive and happy and healthy.
Mhm.
Um, there are obviously going to be a lot of factors that can affect later onset health problems in any dog. A lot of it is going to be the consistent suppression of immune system that has happened, that's really common in vet care, using things like steroids and antibiotics and Apoquel, you know, immunosuppressants that are just given out like candy. Um, so breed specific with regards to things that are probably more prevalent, but something, for example, like my wife has never produced a dog like this, is tracheal hypoplasia, right? So tracheal hypoplasia is, you can think of it as the kind of cholesterol buildup you would have in your blood vessels. You'll have soft tissue like that covering the trachea from the mouth all the way to the lungs. So trachea itself, it's made out of cartilage. It's not bone, right? So it's a cartilage structure, and hypoplasia could be exhibited by that kind of soft tissue bumps, basically blocking the airway. Could also be just the shape itself is deformed to where it constricts the airflow into the lungs. This is a straight up, it's a hereditary genetic condition that is passed on from parents to offspring. And it is something that is definitely more common in bulldog type breeds, brachycephalic skull structure dogs,
Mhm.
than, you know, your typical canine like a German Shepherd. But other breeds do also have it in their genetics. It's just a lot more rare. I mean, this is, you know, we have plenty to say, not just about you know, the state of veterinary care. Breeders, I would say 99% of people breeding dogs in America should not be breeding.
Mm.
It is a big contributing factor to all this mess that pet owners find themselves in, trying to treat these very complex and often deadly hereditary diseases that should, like, because the dogs that should never be bred are being bred, that then you have to go to a veterinarian that's going to commit malpractice on you and kill your dog.
Right.
But oftentimes, you know, it's those genetic hereditary conditions that are precipitating those issues as well. There was, I mean, one situation that I heard of that was, it's just shocking, but at the same time, it's completely, it's the it's a something that it happens all the time. Clearly, there was some breeder in Florida that had a litter of American Bulldog puppies. And here in Las Vegas, we actually knew an owner that got his puppy from that litter. When the owners were picking up their puppies, the breeder told every single owner, including the person that we know here, that once the dog is mature, you want to do a surgery for this condition, tracheal hypoplasia. So basically, a veterinarian would put the dog under anesthesia and surgically try to open up the trachea by removing the soft tissue, probably like burning it off, that kind of thing, or cutting it off. Um, it was preemptively said to the guys, the people that were buying the dog from this breeder. The breeder told them to do that when the dog is older, that they're just buying as a puppy. I mean, how insane is that? And and so when the owner here in Las Vegas from that got a puppy from that litter, his dog was older. He was about a year or a year and a half. He does that surgery like the breeder instructed him to. And then several months later, at exactly a year and a half, actually, the dog dies anyway. And it was suffocation, right? So the dog got a little, too excited, overheated, can't get enough oxygen in. And the dog dies because that kind of surgery, you cannot eliminate that genetic problem. You cannot make the trachea wider, right? There's no surgery for it. You can just do, mostly it's going to be probably cosmetic things, the area where you can reach, where the throat goes into the trachea opening inside the throat that you can reach, where you can maybe clean things up a little bit in terms of the soft tissue blockage. When that person called his breeder when the dog died at a year and a half to let him know his dog is now dead, the breeder told him half his litter mates are also dead, but don't tell anybody.
Okay, so I have a question, Igor. So then if you come across that situation where one or both parents have the tracheal hypoplasia, that's obviously a consideration not to breed. Is that correct?
You should never breed a dog with tracheal hypoplasia, without question. Not even like a matter of both, like one. And that's a thing, right? Because it's a hereditary genetic condition. Like in the instance of my wife's breeding practice of American Bulldogs, she's never produced, hence also never bred a dog with that kind of a condition.
Right.
The focus should always be, right? And I understand, like, there are obviously, dog owners that want to, you know, give life to like a homeless puppy too. But for those that are listening that are actually looking to have a dog from a breeder, because they're, objectively speaking, in terms of genetics, if you're actually going to the right kind of breeder, they're gonna, supersede any kind of unknown history dog you can think of when it comes to just genetics, objectively
Right.
speaking.
Sure.
But one thing that uh, you want to really focus on is longevity, right? There's in this the breeder world in the US, it's all kinds of screwed up, right? Everybody's focused on coat colors, exotics, all this crazy stuff, and it's a petri dish of genetic disease. When the right question is, to be asking your breeder that you're considering getting a dog from is like, how old um, are at what age did the ancestors of this puppy die? Right? That's the core question. And you can't have that information if you just started breeding yesterday, right? And actually, going back to the regulatory things, that is why I say like 99% of the people that are breeding dogs in America should not be breeding. There are no regulations or qualification requirements for breeders in America. Just like dog food, just like all this other stuff, anybody can pick up a male and a female and start breeding and become a breeder. It's genetic engineering. It's extremely complex to do correctly. It's so resource intensive in terms of not just time, but money, um,
So
to do
going off
correctly.
of that, sorry to cut in, but going off of that point, do you have any like red flags, things that people should be on the lookout for when in search of a good breeder versus a bad breeder?
Yeah, for sure. So, one very easy one, right? Any breeder that that stipulates that you spay or neuter your puppy at any age. I mean, some will say like you got to do it immediately. Some will say you got to do it at a certain age, at 2 years old or 3 years, what have you. If that is a breeder stipulation, red flag. Never get a dog from that breeder, because they have, again, it goes back to just no foundational understanding of what that can cause in terms of
Mm.
the health of the dog. And oftentimes, apparently, the reason that that is a stipulation is because these so-called breeders don't want competition, right? So they don't want an owner that they got the puppy from them going and breeding that puppy in the future because it will compete with this breeder. Well, if you are in that kind of position of insecurity as a breeder, to where some random person off the street buying a dog from you is gonna be a competitor to you, it just speaks everything you need to know about the quality of dogs that breeder's producing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we never have that kind of stipulation. We actually provide all the guidance and support to our owners that wish to breed. Like most owners have no interest in breeding whatsoever. They just want a healthy pet. But at the same time, with a breed like American Bulldog specifically, right? It's a dog. It's a breed that's dying in America because there's just not too many good ones anymore. Um, and all these dogs that are crossbreeds being bred, like pit bulls, are being bred as if they're American bulldogs, and then falsified pedigrees and all kinds of stuff. So nothing against pit bulls, but it's just, facts matter, right? Truth matters, like whether it's a mix or a breed. Um, so definitely, any kind of stipulation that you spay or neuter your dog unnecessarily, right? If there's a medical condition that will be alleviated by that, another story, right? That surgery has its role in medicine, but it's not for any kind of discussion when you're picking up an 8-week-old puppy. Um, Another one would be uh, you would always want to ensure that uh, the breeder is actually doing tests for especially hip dysplasia. So you want to see the actual X-rays, not just a report, actual X-rays of the hips. And unfortunately, the only methodology that we trust is called PEMHIP. So it was developed in the 80s by the University of Pennsylvania veterinary school, I believe, director, somebody really high up at the vet school there. And the history actually of um, X-ray testing for hip dysplasia is really interesting. So it actually started in the US. Back in the 50s or 60s, there was a US federal government grant issued to a group of uh, researchers to try to develop a diagnostic system for hip dysplasia in dogs. And that group of researchers developed what's now known and widely used as the hip extended radiograph. So that is your OFA, hips X-ray test. The really weird sort of nugget in that history is that when that grant was issued by the federal government back in the 50s or 60s to this group of researchers, when they developed this hip extended radiograph, the US government took no action at all with regards to the research that was completed. Uh, Obviously it doesn't always happen with the government, but oftentimes, right, you're doing some kind of grants in order to try to apply whatever new knowledge is yielded for maybe some kind of regulatory reasons, right, to try to do something with that information. So here, oddly, the US government took absolutely no action once this research was completed, and that is when this group of researchers started the Orthopedic Foundation for Animals, and they started offering this hip extended radiograph as a service to veterinarians to conduct on dogs to diagnose hip dysplasia. The problem with that methodology is that when you, statistical analysis has been run on the heritability of the hip health. So there is total and absolute consensus that hip dysplasia is a highly, highly hereditary disease. So like dogs are going to produce like dogs, especially over when you have a big enough statistical sample, right? So if parents have good hips, they're more likely to produce puppies with good hips. If parents have bad hips, you're more likely to run into bad hips in the offspring. And the OFA hip extended radiograph, it is when the X-ray is taken, it's just one static view of the hips, and that X-ray is sent to OFA, where they have board-certified radiologists, veterinarians, evaluating it on a subjective scale from like excellent to extreme dysplasia, maybe 5 or 6 levels. So they look at the X-ray in a way like, you know, eyeball it, and then they tell you what the quality of the hips are for that given dog. I mean, if you go online and you'll hear there's even groups for this specific methodology because it's so widely utilized by breeders in America. Um, you know, they will get into these discussions. Oh, you just got to resubmit the X-ray, and then you might get a different score. You know, I mean, that if that is how it works, that's just like, it makes no sense. What's the purpose of doing it? And the statistical analysis that I've seen that was done on this methodology shows exactly that. The scores that OFA assigns in terms of whether a dog has good hips or bad hips is not heritable at all from parents to offspring. It's no better than random. So you can have supposedly dysplastic dogs, according to this methodology, producing dogs with excellent hips, and dogs with excellent hips producing dogs with hip dysplasia, which is just nonsense. And so then there are multiple reasons for it. There are vets actually, you know, goes back to veterinary malpractice a little bit. There are vets that cheat with on behalf of these breeders. So if you're a breeder that has a good relationship with a certain vet, I mean, I don't know if there's any kind of bribery going around, but it wouldn't be surprising. They will manipulate the positioning of the dog, of the hips, to try to maximize that score that the dog is going to get. So the methodology allows for that, right? It's sort of a crapshoot to where sedation is not mandatory. So if you're not sedating the dog and the dog is actually awake while you're doing an X-ray on hips, everything is going to look much tighter and much better because you have the muscles holding everything together, even if their hips are very poor. And you're gonna see a lot less of that poor hip on the X-ray. So there are multiple points of failure using with this methodology, where essentially breeders that are producing dysplastic dogs, they can cheat, and then actually they use that against the buyer, because they'll say, well, these are the parents and they don't have hip dysplasia according to OFA, and what is the buyer going to do at that point? Because their puppy has dysplasia. And when your dog has dysplasia, so they use that against the owner, and it's a type of it's a fraud, it's a con, right? Because you're essentially falsifying the health of the parents, and it's done with the help of this methodology. So that's why in the 80s, this other methodology was developed also in the United States, and it's called PennHip. So like for the University of Pennsylvania, and it is very different. So it is very strict in that a veterinarian must be certified by PennHip in order to conduct to do these X-rays, and it's a set of 3 X-rays. So it actually uses that hip extended radiograph view that OFA requires. But in addition to that, the 2 much more important views are actually the compressed view and the distracted view, which is actually because the sedation is mandatory, you are completely loosening up the muscles. So you're actually checking for the actual anatomical structure. And the compressed view is the baseline 0.00 view, so to say, where the femur heads are inside the hip socket in its default position, like pressed all the way in. So that's the compressed view. And then there's like a parallel rubber bars, well, rubber coated parallel metal bars that are placed on the abdomen of the dog. And the veterinarian pulls the legs out as far as they can come out using that leverage out of the hip sockets, because there is a ligament in each hip that holds the femur head inside the hip socket so it just doesn't fall out. That ligament is what is that ligament has a certain laxity to it, so it can stretch a certain amount to allow that play so that the femur head can actually move. Otherwise, the dog won't be able to move at all. So that laxity is what research has shown to be the hereditary factor. So parents that have a looser ligament are going to produce offspring that are going to have a looser ligament, and tighter ligament is also hereditary, that holds the femur head inside. And so that's that's the actual sort of nitty gritty of what it means to have tight hips on a dog. And so the distracted view, which is the third X-ray that is taken using pen hip, shows that ligament completely stretched out to the maximum, right? So then those three X-rays are sent out, and you actually get an objective score of the dog's individual left and right hips laxity. And it is a ratio of the distance that the femur head center point has moved from the hip socket divided by the radius of the femur head itself. So if the hip moves out of the if the femur head moves out of the hip socket, the actual distance of the radius of the femur head, you're gonna have a score called 1.00, right? That's the ratio, and that is huge risk for hip dysplasia, basically. What you can actually yield from the actual pen hip laxity is fantastic as far as information for any kind of breeder or an owner, because we use that. We know our dogs don't have hip dysplasia, but we still do it because we want to know that number. And so in terms of heritability, it's a regular normal distribution in terms of the laxity. So say like you breed a dog, two dogs that are 0.50 on both hips to each other, you're going to have normal distribution in the offspring that could range maybe from, you could have a litter of pups that's most are going to be 0.5 area, some are going to be 0.4, some are 0.6, right? And so as a breeder, you use those scores you can apply selective pressure if hips were an issue in a given person's breeding program. You're going to be trying to breed those tighter hips out of that litter,
Right.
And then you do that iteration over generations, and then you can immediately almost completely eliminate hip dysplasia from your breeding program, even if you have some incidents of that, right? Granted, hip dysplasia is such an insidious disease to where it can actually appear in a dog as a throwback from like 10, 15 generations ago. So you can have 10 generations of dogs with no hip dysplasia as ancestors, and then there's this lone puppy that has hip dysplasia because 11 generations ago there was a dog with hip dysplasia, and that's how complex the genetics are that define the hip health of a given dog.
Right.
Just a perfect match between the parents, right? Whatever hereditary condition a puppy has, it's always both parents' fault. There's no such thing as it's just one parent's fault.
So we're getting close to the end here. We're going to come back next week if you're available and continue this because the hip dysplasia issue is pretty critical in a lot of breeds, obviously, and this is really good information. So will we see you next Friday night?
Of course.
Okay, good. All right, so we're going to wrap it here. we'll see Igor again next Friday night. We'll continue this discussion. And Colleen, do you have any final thoughts?
It's always a pleasure. Where can people find you if they want to look you up? Any socials or websites you want to give?
So we do have a website for my wife's breeding hobby. It's grandfuturekennel.com. We also do something that we of course offer our owners for free, that advice, guidance, consultation, seeing how to protect yourself from the vet, all that. We also offer consultations to owners of dogs that hadn't come from us, that are struggling with some kind of a chronic situation, that they haven't been able to get vets to diagnose, which is really common. So trying to provide that guidance and advice to the general population is also something we do as consultation. We do charge a fee for that in terms of, it takes an extensive amount of time and resources to do that correctly. But that is also available. We even consult vets. So we give advice to vets that come contact us when they might have a case that's a little more difficult to figure out. Just because, obviously it has to be the kind of vet that doesn't have much of an ego and wants to learn. But
Yeah.
the good vets, they know there's a lot to learn from experienced breeders.
Right. Okay.
We
Very
seem to
good.
know all
Yeah.
about it. You have all the experience, and we love hearing it from you. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Igor. We'll see you next Friday night.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Colleen.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.